Welcome everybody, it's time for a new video. I would like to finish the Dragon 6252, the initial Tiger I did build into Tiger 111 of the Schwere Panzerabteilung 502 in its earliest configuration, still in the end of 1942, but already in deployment. Now, let's get started. My name is Kai, you're watching Tank Brusher 1/5 scale German armor. I did aim for a historical accurate build in this case, and there are some things I miss as well. So I was made aware of this rectangular plate here in the rear being a little bit oversimplified and incorrect. Therefore, I replaced this here, and the frame needs to go as well. Unfortunately, this is something to do off camera, so here is the finished plate. Now this gets covered over, so don't jump at me. Now this thing is the replacement. This is the box how it should look. It's a box, it's open on two sides only, and this didn't change throughout production. I made a second version with inverted bolt heads, because if you're in deep weighting configuration, this one does seal up the air intake and make the whole compartment watertight. Placing these 3D printed parts is pretty straightforward using super glue or CA glue. I usually have different sorts or types of it, slow drying ones, fast drying ones, thick viscosity, thin viscosity and whatnot. There was a little bit an increase in supplies in my toolbox since I started working with these parts. I do prefer to clean up my handles once they are mounted and fully cured on the model before I go into painting, making it more easy to handle them and I don't lose them to the carpet monster all the time. What we have here are the cleaning rods. They are a little bit simplified and not so much to spec. I designed new ones for patrons in May. These are according to original drawings and have a much higher detail. Usually I'm against replacing stuff just for the sake of replacing it, but here it's actually a nice upgrade. For example, the brass caps in the front do have modeled threads. They will show up after given a wash, and for example the caps itself are a little bit more separated from the rods than it would be with a molded one. Last but not least, I have wing nuts on the holders, and yeah, makes it a complete upgrade basically. Nevertheless, two short notices here. My resin is not to spec. You will get a better result by buying it from the merchants or printing it yourself at home. I use very cheap stuff for rapid prototyping, and this was one of these prototypes I had laying around. And I did eyeball the positioning. I refer you to my article on my public Patreon page, so you can do the positioning really spot on. What I show you here is the rear fender. I have made replacements too, since the original injection molded ones don't have the handles and are lacking a little bit detail and are too thick for my liking. I have a few more fixes later down the road, but here's actually now time for cleaning up the model, making sure there's no dust adhering to it and it's ready for painting. Speaking of painting the vehicle, it's base coats. I wanted to try out a different method instead of airbrushing with Tamiya paints, for example. I used this time Vallejo paints, these rattle cans, hobby paint, first starting with a coat of a red primer to give first a protection layer or a safety layer and a good founding. So after that the Panzer Grey rattle can, and this turned out pretty well actually. I did the painting outside on the balcony, so I can't show you the footage unfortunately, yet it did took off about 1.5 hours from my usual airbrush process, and this is a very good thing with me being on a very tight schedule all the time. In rather quick succession I followed up with some hairspray on top of it, so the sheen on the model you will see right now is due to the hairspray. The actual base coat of the rattle cans looks really good, you will have to believe me this time, and if not you can always check it out yourself. So I was, for distressing coat, I was looking for some non-sticky paint, and why I could have used Vallejo surface primer, no, I actually went for some ammo by MIG, different gray tones I had in my box, nothing special, and used a brush and some water to remove it. This is how this whole thing looks a little bit more distressed, or with the base coat fitted. This will help with weathering later down the road. But before I can do so, there is one step left. This would be decals or stencils in my case. I have the original release from 2005, means the decals are 15 years plus by now, so I was not having it. And the second reason for using stencils, of course, is the decals don't feature this specific tank. Plus, stencils always look better, more natural than printed ones. The result is totally awesome for the mammoth in the rear as well as the small one in the front. I did use my Silhouette Portrait 2 and the designs I found randomly on the internet and used the tracing function to generate this stencil. The material for the stencil itself is Aura Mask 810. That seems to be an industry standard. For turret numbers, I use a standard font. That's a German standard. That's DIN 1451. You will find this online. I traced this as well, of course. Last but not least, a small or big mistake. Me using Eduard mask for the bar cross. It turned out a little bit too large. I should have measured twice here in this case. Okay, time to move on into the weathering segment, and before I do so, I would like to be honest with you guys. I had some medical issues going on and got fixed up, and there was only one weekend remaining in this month where I could sit down and do some weathering. Therefore, my whole weathering process is extremely sped up and compressed to a bare minimum, doing some cherry picking here. If you are in for a full weathering tutorial, I would like to point you to this book by Michael Rinaldi, Tank Art 1. This is not a sponsored content or paid in any form or case. I asked him permission to show you guys some of the stuff on the book because I was planning on really hacking it very, very tightly while doing my own weathering. It turned out I don't have the time to follow all his steps. So yeah, I just want to show you guys this is the way to go. This is one way to go about this vehicle. I do like that he really has a lot of text in his book, in his article, explaining every step and the thoughts behind it. This is much superior to some of the I say magazine article style stuff where you have some pictures and annotations to it and that's all. But here he goes into really great detail, and actually it doesn't matter too much if you use oil or enamels or what type of product you actually have at hand. I personally got a lot from reading his stuff. Nevertheless, I have to compress it extremely densely, just picking the stuff that fits my schedule, like I said before. So you can check his stuff out. It's really well made, high quality photographs, and the layout or the editing is superior to anything I have seen before. Okay, enough floundering, let's get into the weathering segment. Into the weathering. Now, let me start by apologize for this being not a continuous process with the stencils. It happened to be Saturday evening, so the pigments had a chance to really cure or dry through overnight, and that was more important to me than having this a continuous, I do this and then I do that. So, but you will get along, I hope. Now to the side of the hull. I use a mixture of random bright pigments I have in my toolbox, and this is a complete random mix. The idea behind is getting a little bit variety in and making it look not so boring as if we would only use one pigment type. So I stacked this onto the side of the hull using some adhesive to put them on, and this adhesive happens to be Tamiya X20A thinner. I used this advice given by Michael Rinaldi's book, but I would like to add this X20A does eat through some sorts of paint, so you would need to test this with your stuff you are going to use. And X20A has a volume by itself when it dries, so a careful application would be advisable. For the application itself, I do layer this stuff on, of course, following up here with a very dark pigment to bring a little bit more contrast in. This is how this looks after it has dried overnight. I personally think this looks good, and the technique overall has a very good return value, I would like to call this. So with actual very little time investment, we get a good effect. And in the reality of having this model sitting on the shelf now, it's actually not possible to see all too much of the rear wall. So we avoid falling into the trap of over weathering something that is actually not visible in the end. Moving on to the road wheels, I use pretty much the very same technique, but a little bit more refined in its execution and some steps in between. Here I start by first moistening the surface with the X20A thinner. I figured out it works better this way around instead of adding it to the model later when everything is covered with pigments. And then there are two passes of cleanup. My first cleanup process I show you here is actually just using a brush and getting rid of the grainy look, making it a little bit more dynamic. I figured out the whole pigment stuff would actually be a little bit flatter once the wheels are spinning. And what I don't show you actually here is after I'm done with this pass, I use a very small and stiff brush to remove all the stuff from the tires, that is all the excess, and make sure we see some details again in the center of the road wheels. For the drive sprocket, for example, the cleanup process is much more thorough and I remove a lot more stuff compared to the road wheels here on the toothed ring, so we can actually see some wear and tear. When I was preparing these road wheels, I was already painting them in a polished metal, at least the tooths. And instead of following up with a dark pigment, I used the speckling method and a dark brown enamel wash. It's a random one, I can't tell you what actually I used. It doesn't matter, it's just for adding contrast, adding a little bit a grimy look. Last notice on the tires, I use Ammo by Mig rubber and tires as a base coat for the rubber parts. I get asked this all the time. To get started on the sides, I wanted to have a filter, but not a filter product per se. I use Kursk Soil by Ammo by Mig, that's a enamel product here, and I apply this first with the brush, getting a little bit more wide or claiming more room in the rear than I do in the front. This gets combined with enamel odorless thinner and I start blending it into the surface. And I want to have a little bit a wedge form from the front to the rear, blending this in, making it look like a heavy filter, like I said, and not like any other effect we would usually get, like streaks or something like this. This will serve as a foundation in the sides on the rear to help the transitioning, getting the thing really dirty down there and making it a little bit more dusty on the top instead. More than 10 minutes into the video, introducing another change to the build is actually suboptimal. But I was in debate with myself right from the start of the build if I leave the fire extinguisher and the spare antenna tube on the model, and I decided now to remove them. This was the last chance. We have photos actually showing them not mounted in this early appearance, in this very early configuration, before a lot of the changes happened that were introduced by the troops using this vehicle. If you haven't subscribed by now, please do so, because I have two more follow-up projects for these Abteilung 502 Tigers showing their change of shape and configuration during their deployment within the Abteilung 502. Now back to the weathering on the side hull. I used a dark brown wash first to get a little bit a usage going, making this a little bit more grimy and used up. This is only the top edge, the leading edge, more to the front than it would be in the rear, because the rear gets covered up in dirt. Throughout the weathering process, my color palette stays the same. This was done in a very compressed time, of course, so I used the same random dark brown wash for creating the shadows, creating the usage, and I use the same 3 enamel paints for getting the dirt going. This here Kursk Soil, I think Dry Mud and Damp Earth, I think was the names of the products. I use them by Ammo by Mig. It's just what I have in the toolbox. Here I use the speckling method to get some streaks going. Using speckling for application is actually pretty good to get a little bit better variety while not requiring the same amount of control you would actually get when you place the streaks one by one. It's a little bit a trade-off. It's more speed but less control, yet it offers more control compared to the Panda V2 I built previously when I did the whole process just using the airbrush. Here with the streaking, my brush is almost dry. There's just a hint of enamel odorless thinner on there. The more dry the brush is, the more you preserve the grainy detail in the rear or behind it. If you would soak your brush with thinner, you would end up with the filter effect we had earlier in the stage before. Now I add a second layer with the Kursk soil again, and then switching directly to the dry mud color, making it a little bit more bright. The bright color I focus more on the front, while the Kursk soil is more heavy applied here in the rear, making it look like there's more dirt in the rear. For those of you who are following my channel for a while now, you guys will notice a transition in the near future. I'm building on a very tight time schedule, and the more bloat I get overboard, the more refinement I can bring into the weathering once again. So at the moment I would like to more focus on the composition of placing the effects, and later down the road again I would like to get back into nailing the techniques, doing it in a more refined way and leading to a better looking result. This weathering here is aimed for sitting in my cabinet looking good overall from half a meter away, and yeah, it will stand no chance in a competition environment, but this is not the goal of the build at all. With the spillage cleaned up, this is the side plate is finished, and the process is repeated all over again on each plate and surface of the model. I zapped a little bit into the future because the tracks are already prepared and mounted here. If you are curious how I go about my tracks, please watch the video I put in the info box up there right now, because it's the same thing all over again and I don't want to repeat this in every build video. The tracks are my own design, they are 3D printed of course, and they are looking great in this case. When we transition from a vertical into a horizontal surface, there is a difference in distribution or composition of the effect. As I said, I do the same thing all over again, using first the filter effect, using the speckling method, using the brown stuff to get a little bit more wear and tear and overall usage going, and I speckle it again before I go over the pigments in the last step. The only difference here is we have to think about a composition where the crew is walking and using the tank, less dirt would adhere over time. And that's something I actually tried to copy directly from Michael Rinaldi's approach. Yet I failed a little bit in getting the contrast where it needs to be, leaving the free room there to make the effect or enable the effects to breathe or to contrast against. This is something that needs to be practiced in my opinion. Okay, this is where I came out with the enamel weathering, the first layers, and now I are still missing the pigment ones in the next step. Nevertheless, I think this looks halfway where I wanted it to look. It's about 80% of what I wanted. I got here, it's a little bit out of scale, meaning the speckling is too large, and therefore I need a unification layer or a dust coat to bring these together again to make it look like a little bit more to scale. This is something I will achieve with this step now. For pigments I still use the same combination or mixture I used before, and now I'm applying this in not really random spots, by spots I want to enhance and unify a little bit together, adding a little bit something that looks interesting. I apply the pigments dry for now and remove them using a soft makeup brush. This makes really good dirt stains or dust stains, better to say, here in the front where the vehicle would not be too much abused. I figured out it would be a nice contrast using the pigments. Their finer grain actually makes the whole thing look more to scale. Here on the side walls, to bring these, I showed these in great detail, so it's just fair to show the finishing steps on it. I first apply a layer of dust. The pigment gets removed almost completely, only what adheres by itself is placed there. and then I use some X20A again and build up some texture where I would figure out they would adhere, some dirt gets thrown up by the track and sticks, basically. Yeah, this is how this looks once dry and cleaned up. The whole refinement process or the cleanup process took a little bit longer than what I show you here, but with the result for itself, I'm actually happy, but I'm not satisfied, and that's the best possible outcome, staying hungry for a better finish in the next build, of course. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I see you next time.